Imagine walking into a tennis stadium in Cincinnati, expecting the usual crowd, and instead hearing thousands of Filipino voices rising from the stands. Here's the question that makes this story so fascinating. If Cincinnati has only a relatively small Filipino population, how did Alex Eala become capable of drawing such an enormous Filipino presence around the tournament? And this isn't happening by accident. The Cincinnati Open itself has singled Eala out as a player whose fans are ardent and raucous, following her around the world. But there's an even bigger reason this matters. Alex Eala isn't simply playing another WTA 1000 event. She arrives in Cincinnati after a remarkable stretch that has transformed her profile across international tennis, including her historic Wimbledon run and her breakthrough WTA singles title in Washington. So the real mystery isn't whether Filipinos love Alex Eala. We already know they do. The bigger question is, how far are those fans willing to travel to see her play? Because if the crowds in Cincinnati are anything to go by, the answer may be much farther than anyone expected. And that's where this story gets really interesting. The first thing to understand is that Alex Eala's audience is no longer limited by geography. That may be the biggest shift in her rise. When Eala plays, Filipino supporters have repeatedly shown that they are willing to travel, rearrange plans, and turn up in places where you might not expect a huge Filipino crowd. We saw that phenomenon at the Italian Open, where Filipino fans traveled to Rome and made their presence heard around Eala's matches. And Cincinnati presents a completely different challenge. This is not Toronto, where a massive Filipino community makes a huge turnout much easier to explain. Reports around Eala's Cincinnati debut have contrasted the relatively small Filipino population in Cincinnati with the enormous crowds she has attracted elsewhere. So where do those fans come from? The answer may be scattered across the entire region. Filipino supporters don't necessarily have to live inside Cincinnati city limits. They can come from surrounding communities, neighboring states, and much farther away. And when a player becomes a national sporting symbol, the distance between home and stadium suddenly matters a lot less. Eala's recent success has only accelerated that effect. She entered Cincinnati as the number 17 seed after winning her first WTA singles title in Washington and making another deep run in Toronto. Then there is the emotional connection. At Wimbledon, Eala became the first Filipino player to reach the second week of a Grand Slam, defeating defending champion Iga Swiatek along the way. The WTA itself highlighted the significance of the moment and Eala's message to Filipino fans. That changes the equation. Fans aren't simply buying a ticket to watch a tennis match anymore. For many of them, watching Alex Eala means witnessing a piece of Philippine sporting history. And that explains why a question about 11,000 seats becomes much more complicated than simply counting Filipinos living in Cincinnati. But there is still one crucial question left. Can Eala actually turn that passionate fan base into a sustained home court advantage in Cincinnati? Because the crowd may be loud. The real test is whether that energy can follow her onto the court. And now we get to the part that makes Alex Eala's Cincinnati story so much bigger than one tennis match. The crowd is not simply reacting to a player who is winning. It is reacting to what Eala represents. Just days ago, Eala reached a new career-high number 18 in the WTA Live rankings, another sign of how quickly her status has changed on the global tennis stage. But rankings alone don't explain the atmosphere. Look at what happened in Washington. Eala became the first Filipino to win a WTA Tour singles title, and tournament officials and players openly noticed the extraordinary support surrounding her. The Washington final was played in front of packed stands, with Filipino fans turning the occasion into something that felt much larger than a normal tennis final. Then came Cincinnati. Eala arrived as a number 17 seed, carrying the momentum of that Washington breakthrough and a strong North American hardcourt swing. And suddenly, her opponents aren't just preparing for Eala's left-handed game, her aggressive baseline tennis, or the pressure she creates during long rallies. They're preparing for the atmosphere. That's not just speculation. Amanda Anisimova, Eala's next opponent, has already acknowledged the crowd energy ahead of their Cincinnati meeting. Think about what that means. A professional tennis player normally has to deal with the opponent on the other side of the net. But when one player has thousands of passionate supporters behind her, every momentum swing can feel amplified. A big point becomes louder. A comeback becomes more emotional, and an opponent has to remain composed while an entire section of the stadium erupts for the other player. That's the hidden power of Eala's fan base. And it also explains why the phrase, "only 2,000 Filipinos live in Cincinnati," can be misleading when trying to understand her audience. A tennis tournament doesn't draw fans, according to city population statistics. It draws people who care enough to attend. And Alex Eala has reached a point where her supporters are willing to make the trip. That is the bigger story. Because if this momentum continues, Eala may not need to be playing in Manila to create something resembling a home court atmosphere. And that could become one of the most fascinating developments of her rise, as now the bigger picture becomes clear. Alex Eala does not need Cincinnati to contain thousands upon thousands of Filipino residents for her matches to feel like a Filipino sporting event. Her fan base has become regional, national, and increasingly international. The evidence was already visible earlier this year. At multiple tournaments, Filipino supporters began arriving hours before Eala's matches, with queues stretching around venues. Roland Garros noted that her growing popularity was being felt in cities across the tennis calendar, while Eala herself said 2026 was a year she truly realized how many people were willing to buy tickets and make time to watch her play. And Cincinnati appears to be another chapter in that same phenomenon. The tournament itself has been expanding its fan experience in 2026, transforming the event into a much larger destination with additional days, entertainment, and activities across the grounds. But Eala brings something completely different to that environment. She brings a community that can travel, a community that can organize, and, perhaps most importantly, a community that sees her success as something personal. That is why the number of Filipinos officially living inside Cincinnati doesn't tell the whole story. The real audience is much larger than the city limits. And that's what makes Eala's rise so extraordinary. She has become the kind of athlete who can make a tournament feel different simply because she is in the draw. The ultimate test, however, is still ahead. Can she continue converting that incredible support into victories against the world's best? Because the crowds can create the atmosphere. They can lift her during difficult moments. They can make an opponent feel the pressure. But once the umpire calls time, Eala still has to win the points. And if her results continue matching the passion of her supporters, the question may soon change. Instead of asking how Alex Eala could attract thousands of Filipino fans in Cincinnati, people may start asking something much bigger. How many more cities around the world can Alex Eala turn into a home crowd? That may ultimately be the most powerful part of her story. Not simply that Filipinos are showing up, but that Alex Eala is giving an entire community a reason to show up together. And if that momentum continues through the American hardcourt season and into the biggest stages of the sport, her fan base could become one of the most recognizable forces in women's tennis. The numbers may change. The cities may change. The opponents will definitely change. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Where Alex Eala goes, her fans follow. And that could be the beginning of something much bigger than tennis.